would like to say good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I hope that you are having a beautiful and safe day. I'm in Colorado and we have really cold wind and snow happening. And we have presenters from 2 different states today. So let me tell you about them. First, I should say, this is the NCURA, or today's brought to you by NCURA PEDC for Region 7. The National Council of University Research Administrators, Region 7, Professional Education and Development Committee is pleased to welcome you to today's presentation. The purpose of the PEDC is to support professional development activities for regional members and to provide a broad range of educational services to ensure all regional members have access to professional development and programming. My name is Catherine O'Hare, and it is my pleasure to serve as your chair for the PEDC Region 7 and help facilitate today for the webinar. Please note today's call is being recorded. This presentation will last about 60 minutes. Whether you're using audio on your phone or computer, please make sure that you're muted during the presentation, and then you can unmute later if we have questions or Q&A time. But also you can leave them in the chat and we will address those. You can also use the raise hand feature in Zoom. So we'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation, and I will post a survey in the chat. So please complete that. It really is helpful to let us know what is working and what we can offer in the future. Now it is my pleasure to introduce your presenters for the day. First, we have Tricia Callahan. She is a Senior Research Education and Information Officer at Colorado State University. And she's been on the PEDC for a few years. And then we have Kyle Unruh. He is Director of Office of Sponsored Programs at University of Montana. I've known Kyle for a long time from Colorado or CU Boulder, University of Colorado, and he has recently joined the PEDC. So we're happy to have them share their expertise today on how to craft a good presentation and prepare for the next regional meeting or the next idea that you're going to submit. So it's up to you, Tricia and Kyle, or off to you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Catherine. I thought when you were doing introductions, you said we had 16 minutes, and I thought, well, we're going to run through this fast. So closer to 60 minutes. Thank you all very much for joining us. So the Falcon and the Phoenix, the very first steps in developing an effective presentation. So what are we going to go through and what are we not going to go through? Sorry, let me back up here just a second. We are going to go through really those first steps in development. So it's not going to be so much into how do you give an effective presentation. We can certainly do that in a later webinar. But here it's really as you're preparing, as you see that call for proposals come out, and you'll be seeing the call for regional proposals for our regional meeting in Tucson coming out within the next month or so. As you're thinking about presenting and responding to that call, you know you have to at least submit a title and a description and some learning objectives. And I don't know how many times you've ever attended the session based on the catchy title and based on the description, only to find out it maybe wasn't exactly what you thought it would be. Maybe the content didn't exactly match the description, and maybe the learning objectives weren't met. So to make sure that nobody ever walks away from one of your sessions saying, hey, that's not what I thought it would be, we're putting this together so that way you can really focus on those first steps of developing your session title, your session description, and those learner objectives. So just a reminder that today is meant to be an overview session and that we are going to actually practice writing some sound objectives, and we're going to practice identifying different types of audience members, and then we're going to look at writing some titles and some descriptions as well. So where are we starting and what are we focusing on? We're really focusing on when you're writing your description and your title and your objectives, you really should be focusing, of course, on the who, what, when, why, where, how, all of those. Think about what knowledge and skills you want your participants or your learners to take away from your session. Okay, what do you want them to be able to do? What new nugget of information or skill do you want them to walk away with? Always think about the why. Why are you doing this? What topic needs to be covered? What gap is there in the knowledge set or in the skill set that needs to be addressed? And this is really a big one. And you might have to, if you have been asked to give a training, you're not just volunteering a training like for a call for proposals, but maybe somebody in your institutions come and ask you to give a training. That happens with Catherine and I all the time because we're the trainers in the office. We really have to dig into the why. What is it that you need to know? I've learned this the hard way. I gave a presentation one time on that I was asked to give on no cost extensions. I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. And so I start writing my stuff on no cost extensions, what they are, and expanded authorities, prior approvals, all of this, and gave the session, and we got done, and the participants were like, well, that was really good, but that's not what we needed to know. What we needed to know is, in our systems and CSU systems, how do we track no cost extension requests that we've sent to the sponsor? How do we know when we got them back? What are the next steps? Who's responsible for what in the process? And I was like, oh. So sometimes you have to take a step back and really communicate with learners and with people who come and ask you for sessions. What is it you need to get out of the session and why? Okay, and start from there. And then also understanding your target audience. In that session, we had a mix of very new research administrators, and we also had people who have been here for years. And so sometimes you'll have that mix, but just make sure when you are writing a session description that you make it very clear who your target audience is, and then you develop your content to suit that audience. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of these in just a minute. And I apologize, I have a little bit of a froggy throat. Okay, and then you'll want to consider when the presentation is going to take place, how it's going to take place. Will it be virtual? There might be some limitations to virtual versus in person. Do you have an hour? We only have an hour today and we have a lot to get in, versus you have a half day or you have a week or months, right? And then again, that how the content will be delivered. So we're going to go through all of this at kind of a pretty in-depth level. So again, the what. What is it that you want your learners to get out of your session? Okay, what are their learner objectives? And we're going to focus on learner objectives here in just a minute. But what is it you want them to walk away with, your participants to walk away with? So learner objectives. Learner objectives should be brief, clear, and smart. And we'll talk on the next slide what we mean by smart. Hopefully you write those objectives before you start developing your content. Okay. Write them with your audience in mind. Okay, is it a novice audience? Are they advanced learners? Is it a mixed group? And then you may have to go back and modify, if you have that luxury of modifying those objectives. And actually, Kyle and I kind of went through this. I wrote the title and objectives. And then when he and I started talking through the presentation, we realized we were getting a little bit of drift away from the objectives. So we had to ask ourselves, what do we really want you all to get out of today? And we actually went back and made some tweaks to those objectives. We were able to do that because the information hadn't already been sent out. But just realize if you're sending this out, say to a call for proposals, you might not have the luxury of changing those objectives. If that's the case, you need to make absolute sure that your content matches. We did a little tweaking of both. We also tried to really stick to our objectives and ask ourselves, is our content straying from the original objectives? And I think in a couple areas we found yes, so we had to rein ourselves back in. So always be looking as after you've written those objectives, is the content matching? Okay, and if not, where do you need to make some changes, whether it's in the content or in the objectives? And Kyle, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free to jump in. Okay, so SMART learning objectives. You've probably seen a graph like this before. SMART learner objectives have 5 distinguishing characteristics. One is that they should be specific. State what you're going to do and use those action words. And on the next slide, we provided a list of action words, and we also provided a link in the resources for you. every time I go to write content, go to write my description and objectives, I pull up that list. I used to have it in a binder and I would just flip to it in my binder. And now I just have it bookmarked and I pull it up and I start, really thinking about what is it do I want my learners to do? I think it's easy to start with, oh, we want them to learn, we want them to understand. But what does that really mean? What does it mean to understand something? And it's usually that you want them to be able to do something. Okay. And you can use those SMART objectives, which you'll see on the next slide. And using those SMART objectives makes it easy to measure your outcomes through evaluation. Did the learners get out of the session what you hoped to convey with your content and with your activities? So SMART objectives are measurable. Okay. They're also achievable in the time frame. Okay. There's only so much we can do today. We can't do best practices on presenting today because we only have an hour. We can just do best practices and putting your description and your content together. Okay. Relevant. Are the objectives relevant to the material? Remember that going back and forth and making a match between your content and your objectives. And time bound really goes back to that, are they achievable? Can you get it done within that time frame? So I'm going to show you some objectives here. And I want you to, read each of these. And after you've read all three, I would like you all to chime into the chat to see which one you think is kind of the strongest objective or maybe the best objective. So the first one, participants will learn about goals and objectives. Okay. Another way you could write that one is participants will learn the difference between goals and objectives. And then another way you could write it is participants will be able to distinguish between goals and objectives. Which one do you think is the stronger learning objective? Or if you have even a stronger learning objective, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of number threes, right? A lot of number threes. Well, it was supposed to be number three because it really tells the learners what they're going to get out of the session, what they're going to be able to do. Again, you can say you're going to learn about goals and objectives, but what does that mean? That's pretty broad, pretty open. We're going back to that S in SMART. We're getting specific. Participants will be able to distinguish between goals and objectives, which I should stop here and tell you the difference between a goal and objective. A goal is typically really broad, overarching. It's qualitative in nature. I'm going to teach you how to do an effective presentation, okay? Versus an objective. An objective is specific, is measurable, it's actionable, it's time bound, all the things that you see on this slide. Okay. And I think sometimes it's easy, and I know I confuse this all the time. It's easy to confuse activities, things that people are really going to do, with objectives. With an objective, there should be more than one way to reach your objective. Participants will be able to distinguish between goals and objectives. We could have a lot of different ways to teach you that material, to test you on that material, to have you review that material. So there's more than one way to meet an objective. An activity, typically there's just one activity that you're doing to meet the objective. Is it okay if you confuse activities with objectives? I think so, because I think the activities are even more specific yet. So an example of an activity here might be participants will practice distinguishing between goals and objectives, the actual activity that you're going to do. We would put some goals up there, we would put some objectives, we would have you practice distinguishing and labeling which is which. So that's the difference between an activity versus an objective. And I think sometimes we can confuse those easily. Again, I go back and I read my objectives, I'm like, oh, really, I wrote an activity there. Okay. So SMART objectives, again, this is the chart that I usually use. And if you look at these, you can see why it's easy to confuse these with activities. But again, I think that's okay. But I use this chart or very similar chart every time I go to write an objective. Okay, and this chart is provided for you under your resources. Okay. So just a little key takeaway from this section is to be very specific when you write your objectives. please try to avoid words like participants will learn, participants will understand, because really, what does that mean? Okay. Instead, get very specific. Participants will be able to distinguish between goals and objectives. What do you want your participants to be able to do or to walk away with? So now it's your time to practice. You're going to give a presentation that's going to highlight some of the updates to uniform guidance. Okay. Take 1 minute. We'll give you 1 minute here to write one SMART objective for your learners. So go ahead and just write it, on your piece of paper, or pull up a notepad on your computer. And then if you'd like, we'll have you share those in the chat. Okay, I feel like we could have had some Jeopardy music playing there while we were waiting, but it might have put you under pressure. Would anybody care to share in the chat your SMART objective? And I'm sure you referenced the chart in the previous slide as you wrote your objective. What did you come up with? Ooh. To make my chat bigger. Learners will be aware of recent updates to uniform guidance and how they relate to specific areas within research administration. I like, oops, sorry, just went away. Kyle, they will be able to identify, very specific, at least one material change. Okay, able to identify, it's telling what they will be able to do. Different ways they can do that, right? So those would be the activities, but you have a good objectives there. Okay. Be able to compare. Okay, yeah, comparing and contrasting, listing, describing. Okay, those are all very specific objectives. Catherine, I like your participants can discuss and apply to their work recent updates. Okay, again, different ways that they might be able to do that. Okay, thank you. The one that Kyle and I came up with when we were talking about this is participants will be able to identify changes, right, in uniform. So again, that really specific identification. So always go back to that list of those strong, specific action verbs. And you'll notice on there that they don't have things like learn or understand, right? Because those are maybe a little wishy-washy and open to interpretation. We don't want this open to interpretation. We want it to be more specific and really start reining it in. Okay, Kyle, I'm going to turn it over to you for audience.
Thanks, Tricia. Before I move forward, does anyone have questions on being specific or word choice or any of these things we've been talking about? All right, I will take it forward. Of course, anytime you do have questions, just drop it in the chat and we'll take a moment to address them. Moving forward, I want to start by talking about audience, who we're presenting to and who we want or what we want our learners to accomplish is largely contingent on who they are and what they're interested in, what they're capable of, and what their expertise is, and how many of them there are, and all these things. So knowing our audience is just tremendously important. Next slide. So by way of identifying our target audience, we need to consider what area or areas of expertise they have, we need to make an effort to identify their experience level. Oftentimes, like such as in this call or many others in NCURA, you won't know for certain whether your audience is advanced or novice, but what you can do is anticipate who would likely have an interest in the material you're going to present and whether or not those people would be more advanced or more novice. And then that, which goes to the last bullet, that can lead you to state who should attend this session. So you want to make sure your session is tailored for the right level of expertise. Next slide. Here's another paradigm for getting at basically the achievable idea in the SMART acronym. So there are a few variables here, all related to what we could expect our audience to be able to achieve given the constraints. And these are some constraints we have. What is the complexity of the material I hope to present? Is it something that is really difficult to convey and nuanced and is really only appropriate for more advanced learners, or is it just an overview and should be accessible to virtually anybody, whether or not they have any experience? The two sides of the spectrum there. And also, is that going to match with the audience I anticipate? So am I planning to try to portray something complex to a novice audience or vice versa? And then also take into consideration the time. And so you can see the spectrum here that in general, the more complex the topics or the content, the fewer the number of objectives you'd want to try to incorporate into the presentation. But that's also contingent on time. If you have less time, even fewer objectives. If you have more time, perhaps you can put in more or a greater number of objectives, even if you have complex topics. So these are some variables to keep your eyes on and scale the volume of your objectives accordingly. Next slide. Once you have your objectives in hand, then it's time to form your title and your description. And as I want to go back to an idea Tricia presented earlier, which was that this isn't entirely linear. We're recommending this procedure, objectives, then title and description. But chances are, especially if you're giving yourself time to develop these things, you'll develop your objectives and hopefully they'll be 90% of the way there. And then you'll go and write your title and your description. But maybe when you're writing your description, you realize, you know what? This objective should really be altered to look like something different, which would alter your title and alter your description. So you might have to go back and iterate on all these things as you go. But generally speaking, take a pass at your objectives first, considering your audience, considering the time you have, considering the complexity of the issues, and then proceed to develop the detailed content or the session title. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about titles and descriptions. The title should have something in it that you anticipate will be interesting to your audience, or you may not have an audience unless it's a mandatory training. So I guess that's another variable here is whether or not your attendees are required to be there. But in any case, to the extent they're not required to be there, you might consider putting something into your title that is intriguing, either because it's creative or because it gives what you feel would be an interesting view into a particular topic just in the title itself. At the same time, just going down the creative path, if it's too creative and too out of bounds, you might find that the title doesn't really describe your objectives and doesn't describe the content. So you have to find a balance between what will be intriguing for your learners and what is in fact a good description of the content of the presentation. And as I mentioned earlier, you can iterate on these things, and it's expected that the very first time you pen your title, it's probably not going to be the title you send in for your proposal. You're going to iterate on it hopefully many times. The more you do, chances are the better it'll get. In any case, here an example of different options coming back to that UG updates example, different options we could put on that. So keeping in the theme of the Falcon and the Phoenix we have on this one. So from the ashes, UG renewal. Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe it gives people some excitement, but it's also a little bit vague and not entirely clear what that session is going to be about. So I don't know. You guys can assess the trade-off there. Recent updates to uniform guidance, very straightforward, very pragmatic. If that's what folks want, that's what they're going to get. You're not leaving much out there. It's not entirely interesting though. Maybe if you put more effort into it, it could be more creative. Uniform guidance then and now. Again, so there's a little bit more intrigue in that one. And maybe it's striking a better balance than the first two. But again, these things are subjective, and your skill at developing titles would presumably just grow over time as you practice doing this. But here are some examples of the different ways you can push your title with regard to being super objective and pragmatic versus being creative, while all at the same time trying to describe what the content you will be getting at in the presentation. Next slide. All right. So what do Falcons and Phoenixes have to do with writing effective session titles? Nothing. We pulled that one out of the blue, but as it goes with being creative, you can find things that you think are intriguing and figure out what the analogy is, or if there are ways to tie whatever it is, the theme throughout the presentation. And that can make the presentation, first of all, more engaging for people. So going back to the uniform guidance example, if we just took that middle of the road description where it was, I can read it right here, recent updates to uniform guidance. That could be your session title. You could get on the session and you could have a checklist of the updates you're going to proceed through, and you could read off the checklist. And then you could ask if there are questions, and folks would have learned what the recent updates to uniform guidance were. But chances are half of the folks might have stopped listening after 4 or 5 minutes. If you ask questions, they probably wouldn't ask you questions because your presentation wasn't provocative. So in any case, I'm just trying to demonstrate that if you can come up with a theme to engage people, it could help your cause. With that, next slide, Tricia. Many of you may have seen this analogy, chicken sandwich and FAA. It seems like we come back to it fairly often.
I'm going to move on to that one. I was going to add on this one,
Oh, sure, Tricia.
Like you said, tying to a theme can make it more interesting. It can also help learners retain information because they, kind of have that hook to hang their learning on. But it can also muddle. If you're spending so much time trying to make content that doesn't easily fit with a theme, like uniform guidance and Falcon and Phoenix. If there's like just no relation, you're spending so much time on that, trying to make that relation, you can just frustrate your participants. So there are times when making those parallels and analogies really work, which we're going to show you here in a second. I've been in sessions, I'm like, I don't get how I have no idea of how these things are related. And I spent all the time trying to figure out how the two things were related, which weren't, that I didn't really learn anything. So just know if you pick a theme that you, that it works, I guess. And so hopefully this next example, and as Kyle said, many of you have seen, and hopefully it will work. So let's see here. I'm going to launch. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
We're going to talk about chicken sandwiches and FAA and how to explain FAA. So I had to give a presentation to my controller's office, and I had not eaten lunch. And I was giving the FAA presentation, and everybody's eyes glossed over, kind of like they had no idea what I was saying. And I had a moment where my stomach rumbled, and then I said, Who's had a Chick-fil-A sandwich? And so if you look at the top chicken sandwich, that's a Chick-fil-A sandwich. You just get a bun, a piece of chicken, and some pickles. That's it. It's like $5. It's very tasty though. Think of that as your award. That's your cost, $5. If you want to add a piece of cheese to it, it might be 75 cents. That's a direct cost because for every piece of cheese, we're charging 75%. We can attribute it to every sandwich. The tomatoes and the lettuce, which actually make it's called a deluxe, those have cost as well. So it may be 10 cents for tomatoes, 35 cents for lettuce. So now you're at like $6. But if you think of all of those things that you're adding, if you want to add bacon, I always add bacon to everything.
How much is the bacon, Shay?
$1.
I'm getting
You
hungry.
can add
I'm
bacon.
getting hungry just listening to you.
To the sandwich, it's like $1. I didn't put the bacon on there. But if you think about the sandwich itself, by itself, it's $5. All of those costs that you attribute, those additional things that you need, those would also be direct costs. But built into that $5, a piece of chicken, a bun, and some pickles doesn't really cost $5. There's other things built into that that you can't readily identify. Like when you go to Chick-fil-A, you got to go to a building. And the cost for that building, you can't say for every chicken sandwich, every brick, we're going to, assign to a chicken sandwich. The people that greet you with a smile or stand out in the rain under those plastic tents at the drive-thru and take your order and smile at you really nicely. Every time they ring you up, you can't say, oh, that costs 10 cents, and I'm gonna add it to the cost of the chicken sandwich. Same thing with the equipment that they're using at the back. We don't know what that costs, but we're attributing a portion of that to pay for it. So everything they pay includes those peripheral type costs in it. Those are F&A on that side. Any questions about that? Is that very?
Thanks, Tricia. So I hope you all noticed, or most of you at least, that you wanted to listen to what she had to say. Now, why did you want to listen? Because she's talking about chicken sandwiches. I mean, you've heard about F&A 1,000 times, but you want to hear what she has to say about chicken sandwiches and how that relates to F&A. How is she going to pull this together? And is it going to be interesting to me? And so it's, as Tricia was alluding to earlier, one reason I believe this is so successful is because she's done a great job balancing sort of the outside creative subject with the content and keeping the content moving while capturing your mind and bringing it into the Chick-fil-A world. So that's difficult. I mean, it takes practice. It takes more energy to develop a presentation with that. But Tricia and I are convinced that if you do, your audience will be more engaged and you'll be more likely to achieve the objectives you set out. Next slide, Tricia. So in summary, once again, we encourage you to write your objectives first and use that SMART tool or rubric to make sure that your objectives are specific and measurable and achievable and all the SMART things. Be realistic about what you want your learners to get out of the session, and remember that's entirely contingent on who your learners are, the complexity of the material you anticipate you'll present, and how much time you have. So to the extent they're more complex, they're less experienced, and you have less time, you need a fewer number of objectives. If they're more advanced, you have more time, less complex, you can build in more objectives. And Tricia made a great point up front about if you have the opportunity, survey your audience, figure out exactly what they want to know. And then it won't be necessarily your job to identify at that point exactly what they want to know, because they'll tell you, but you can identify an effective way to present it to them. And you'll be there as the expert to answer questions they have and whatnot.
Great.
Yeah,
And I think you made a good point about, we had to present this in a linear fashion, and we actually changed the order up of the slides. I don't know how many times,
yeah.
right? Because it was kind of like cart before horse in so many different places. But I think that just, goes back to your point about always going back and making sure that there's a match then. Content with title with objectives. Natalie Buys is here on the call, and she and I are developing a workshop in conjunction with another colleague for PRA, FRA, and we have spent countless hours developing content and fine tuning and honing, and we got ready to submit it because it was due, just recently. And I looked back, and one of our objectives said that we would talk about cost share in there, and that people would, we didn't say understand cost share, we didn't use that word, but we did, have an objective around cost share, or else it was in our description. And I look back, I'm like, we really didn't talk about cost share. So we had to give the learners what we promised in our description, right, in our content. Somebody may come to our workshop and pay for that additional workshop because they're like, I wanted to hear more about cost share. And that was in your description and you didn't even touch on it. And so we had to make sure that we put in some slides and activities around cost share. So always just kind of going back and double checking to make sure that your content is actually matching your description. Again, particularly those times we send those descriptions out months in advance, and then we develop that content later to make sure that there's the match there. So.
Thanks, Tricia. Last couple bullets, we've talked through them, but take a stab at developing a creative, intriguing title, and then figure out, okay, does this describe what I'm going to put into this presentation or not? If not, is there some way to adapt it? Do I just need to scrap it and start over? At least give it a shot. And if you strike the right balance, you might find your attendance goes up and your learners have the right expectations coming in. Anyway, we'll say it one last time. Descriptions and titles should flow from objectives and make sure there's a match.
Right. So if you can start with those objectives, I think it's, for me, the fun part is developing the content and the activities. And so I want to jump right in there. And it's hard to take that step back and to really, again, think about, and I've had that happen, as I shared, where I jumped into developing content, I presented it, and they're like, yeah, it was great, but it was totally off the mark of what we needed. So make sure that you're understanding what those objectives should be. What is it that the learners need to get out of it? And then at the very end, you'll provide some type of evaluation. And Kat, can you share the evaluation link in the chat, please? Always then going back and getting feedback, and hopefully some of the feedback you receive is not, well, this session isn't exactly what I thought it would be. It didn't match your description at all. Hopefully it's spot on because you've written really smart objectives and you've made sure that your content match those objectives. So we do ask that you take a moment, please. We really value the feedback. So if you could take a moment and click on that link, at least you have it up. The evaluation is very short. And one thing we do have in there is if you have interest in follow-up session on actually leading an effective presentation. So we talked about the first steps and making sure that you have really sound objectives, descriptions. But if you want to learn more about content development, learn some more about best practices in presenting, let us know. And let us know if there are other topics, because typically during these webinars, let me get to it. We end with the last slide that says what's coming up next. I don't know, Kat, that we have anything slated for coming up next. If we do, I apologize, I've missed it, but we want to hear from you on topics. And if you have one that you're wanting to present, let us know that as well.
We don't have specifically a presentation finalized yet for the upcoming months, but we can give you a teaser that we're going to do some networking hot topic table things called like Roundup in Region 7. So that, yeah, contact us with your ideas, what you want to talk about, what's going on in your university that you could use some collaboration time or a sounding board for. So you'll see an email for that shortly.
Okay. And we did leave you with some resources here. Again, that SMART objectives that I encourage you to have open when you're writing your objectives. Also, the Bloom's taxonomy list, it gives you a quick list of, do you want your learners to be able to describe, compare and contrast, list, what is it you want your learners to do? And then of course the fun video, not only fun, but really, really informative. I would love to share that with all of our investigators on our campus so they understand F&A. But if you have questions, please reach out to Kyle and I. If you have questions specific to this webinar, please reach out to us. Also, again, if you have future topics, either include them in the survey or reach out to us at that osp_info@mail.colostate.edu. Catherine monitors that email, and she's also the chair of this committee, so we can get your ideas on the agenda for discussion. So, also, this recording, along with our handouts, will be on our regional website. And Catherine already put that there in the chat. So any other questions here?
I liked how you brought up that people can submit ideas. If you haven't done a presentation before at regional or national, and that's like really intimidating, work with PEDC, because if you have an idea and you want a